Okay, we are live. Welcome everybody to a Parshas Tetzaveh, Rick, Rabbi, and Rashi, and other Torah commentaries. And we're going to talk about, in this short podcast or YouTube video, we're going to talk about the special Parsha of Tetzaveh, which discusses a few things. Just a quick lineup. It discusses Moshe's commands to the Jews to bring the oil to Moshe that they can then light up the menorah, oil to light up the menorah. It's going to talk about the priestly garments, the Kohen Gadol, which happened to be Aaron, Moshe's brother, and his children, the Kohanim. They got special clothes they had to wear. They specifically had to wear these clothes that delineates in this parsha. It's also going to talk about the inauguration rites of how Aaron and his sons became Kohanim the first time. There was a certain ritual or the whole process. So that's a will, and more about that. So let's talk a little quickly about the Parshas Tetzaveh. Tetzaveh, a quick fun fact. I don't know if you might have noticed this, Rick. What's the fun fact I'm going to say? If it's a total random thing.
I don't know.
Okay, so in the commentary, it spoke a little bit about this is the one parsha that Moshe is introduced, and when Moshe is introduced, and he's not mentioned by name. You don't find Moshe's name once in this whole parsha. So there's a little jeopardy.
That's interesting. I did catch that. That's good. Okay, I learned something new.
There's a backstory of why Moshe is not mentioned. Like, he's mentioned every other time from his birth and on. So it has to do with actually next week's Torah portion, which discusses the sin of the golden calf. And the sin of the golden calf, was, whatchamacallit, God wanted to annihilate the Jews. And Moshe started bargaining and praying and pleading. And Moshe told Hashem, he gave him an ultimatum. If you don't forgive the Jews and you do destroy them and start over, then erase me from your book. And for Moshe is the embodiment of Torah. So for Moshe to say erase me from the book, he was really giving his whole essence over. Now, ultimately, God did forgive the Jews. Yet it says the words of the righteous, who are a conduit for godliness, whatever they say is kind of a mini prophecy, and it has to take place in a small way. So this was where at least one parsha Moshe is not mentioned. I mean, although God didn't annihilate the Jews, so therefore no need to take Moshe out of the book. But he said it, and there's some deep spirituality there. It had to take place at some level. Hence here. Okay, that's the fun fact to start off with. So let's start with some questions you noticed.
Okay, so first of all, I found the piece about the candelabra very interesting. Last week we had talked a bit about how the candelabra came out of the fire, and now we have the oil for it, and sort of it's kind of a defining piece about what we are as Jews. I think that was fascinating in the parsha, the discussion, and how the oil has to be made, and what kinds of things you can do with it. That's fascinating. But my real first question has to do with why is it necessary to participate in the religious sacrifices through a surrogate? The priests. I mean, it's very specific about the offerings and what happens in this parsha. If we as Jews are considered to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a holy people, why do we have to have a surrogate to pray through?
So basically you're saying this last parsha and this parsha, this parsha particularly talks about, highlights the Kohen, the garments, the inauguration rites, all that. And the question you're asking is, if you remember from a few short parshes ago, right before God gives the Torah, he says, you are going to be mamleches kohanim. You're going to be a nation of priests.
Right.
And if we're a nation of priests, then why is it sort of only given, the actual priestly rites are given to a very small group, Aaron and his sons. So that's the question. And you should know you're not the first one to think of this question. Famous biblical character Korach, which we'll get to in a few.
I remember Korach, of course. Yeah, that wasn't a good question. It wasn't a good question for Korach to ask, though. Probably.
Well, it's actually, when we get to Korach in a few months, there'll be a lot to talk about Korach. But as relevant here, that was his question. He says, all the Jews are holy. If all the Jews are holy, and why is it only for Aaron and his sons? And we can get into Korach. Korach actually was a very smart, very spiritual person. He had a whole ideology. It wasn't just like a power grab. But the basic idea is, like you're saying, if everybody's a Kohen, and we're called Kohanim, why is it only for Aaron and his sons? So the very short question, there's the historical answer, and then there's sort of we can philosophize together the idea of a proxy, a surrogate. So the historical answer is like this. Actually, every firstborn was going to be the role of the Kohen. So you had a family, the Schwartzes, the Levines, the Greenbergs, their firstborn son would have been the Kohen. And that is very understandable because God actually owns the firstborn. Hey, he saved them from the firstborn plague. So they're sort of dedicated to this spiritual priestly service. That's what would have been. But due to the sin of the golden calf, which every tribe had some participation in, beside the tribe of Levi, lost that privilege, or they weren't. Like this: while the soul is priestly, perhaps their body or their outer persona could not house that, could not channel that priestliness of every Jew. The only tribe that did not succumb to the sin of the golden calf was the tribe of Levi. And they were, besides that, they in general were very much in Egypt. They weren't enslaved. They were always considered the spiritual leadership. They were given this as a default, not as default, as sort of like, it can't be by the firstborn sons because of the sin of the golden calf, which they all took place part of. And therefore, it has to go to the sort of the pure tribe that did not participate, which is the tribe of Levi. And in Levi itself, it goes to Aaron, because Aaron had displayed certain very important qualities. As Aaron was a Rodev Shalom, he pursued peace. He was very kind. Moshe was the lawgiver. Aaron was the peacemaker between people. He was the people's rabbi, so to speak. So maybe that's why Aaron, out of all the Levites, became the family of the Kohanim. Although the Levites did participate in other rites. So they guarded, they did the music. So that's the short historical answer. We would have all been indeed represented by our families firstborn as a Kohen, but it wasn't it didn't work because of the sin of the golden calf. That's the historical just answer. Philosophically, we can ask, though, why did God set it up this way? Whether it's, initially or after the fact, that there's an idea of a surrogate, that there's an idea of a proxy for all of us. And that is really what the Kohen Gadol is, sort of the spiritual proxy of the epitome of spirituality. All the other Kohanim are sort of they represent us. They do our sacrifices for us there. We donate the lamb and they bring it up to the altar.
So what's interesting is that after the destruction of the temple and rabbinic Judaism, because we've talked about rabbinic Judaism after the fact, so sacrifice turns into prayer, right?
Yeah.
So prayer is actually individual, and they talk about having prayer from the heart within the parsha. They talk sort of about that kind of prayer that comes from the heart, and I find that also an interesting thing to think about in terms of what was historically and what is today. It's sort of make it relevant for what we're thinking about in terms of our own Judaism and how we approach it.
It's very important to study the history, the Torah, and the translation into our personal post-temple time today. It's very important because you see there's so much, and you read the Chumash, there's so much symbolism of all this, right, these details, and this represents that. And but I just want to say very short, like you're saying, yeah, prayer, it sort of re-democratizes everything in a way. right? Because now everybody prays, everybody's doing the service.
Right.
But I think, but just to philosophize for one more minute, the idea of a Kohen, the idea of a proxy, a spiritual, the big kahuna, or the guy who's the most spiritually, perfect, so to speak, and he's representing all the Jews. Why does it have to be like that? And that's when we get to Korach, we'll learn more about that. But very short. God, what we can see from Moshe's answer to Korach, who challenged the idea of a centralized Kohen, Moshe answered, and this is sort of like one of the questions you wrote. Moshe said that, I think the verse was like, in the morning we'll go test this out. He pushed them off to the morning. Rashi there says that he was actually intimating an idea that just like there's morning and night, right? There's duality, there's morning, there's night.
Right.
There's set things in nature. So too, it's a spiritual nature. There is a Kohen. Let's call him the day, the morning, the spiritually, outwardly perfect. And then there's the night. There's the people that, like us, who are more. It's more of it's a more hidden priestliness or holiness. But
of course, the priest, you realize, has that dual role on both ends of that, which is a little different than what we see as sort of male and female or day and night, that duality that we see within the Torah. The priest in this particular instance actually has the part for the priestliness and also for the laity. I mean, it's a dual role there.
For sure. I think it's the idea, though, then you have to have the laity, meaning it's not really two things. As we know, we speak a lot in Judaism. And I think in multiplication questions, they say this answer is always C. C is your best bet. So it's not one, it's not two, it's always three. Three is the big number because that's the idea of reconciliation, two opposites or two poles. So you have Moshe, so you have Aaron. God sets up that there's this sort of spiritual perfect representative. Then you have the rest of us that are imperfect or more dealing, even if we're perfect, hey, some of us, but I'm saying the idea that we're dealing in an imperfect world. We're not in a perfect setting like the Kohen is in the temple. We're in a very imperfect world, making light out of darkness. So the basic idea of the basic idea of why God sets up is, think about a body. There's the brain, there's the heart, and then there's all the limbs. And I didn't research this enough, but it's actually interesting. Moshe is compared to the brain. Moshe is always the brain is brought down as the sort of the portal for the soul. That's why it's the most delicate. It's the most intricate because it's the portal from there to the nervous system and everywhere else. The heart, though, I'm guessing here, but it sounds okay. Aaron's the heart, also a central limb. So these two central limbs, they're not standalone. They're interconnected. They're interconnected, and it's really about a symbiosis of let's say in this case Aaron, the heart, and all the limbs. Why did God make the body like that? Why can't the fingernails, the toes have the same primacy of bringing the soul? Why if you chop a finger off, God forbid, you're still alive. But if you chop a heart off or a brain, you can't live.
Right.
This is the way God. Now, why did God make this in nature? This idea that there's more sensitive, or I don't call it primary, because it's not primary in of itself. It's just more for the sake of spirituality. It's more primary in this process. Why did God do that? I think it's because both have a role, and this actually will fit well into the idea of some of the symbolism of the clothes. The Jewish people are made up of, you have to break it down into two categories, right? There's, like I say the joke, right? There are those that divide people into two categories and those that don't.
Right.
Two types of people, those that divide two categories and those that don't.
Right.
But you have here, there's tzaddikim, there's the righteous, the far and few. Their whole idea of their role in this world is really, like you say, to be a role model, to be a sort of like almost a window to a higher reality. They're just perfect. Perfect in the sense they're saintly. Then there's the 99.9% of us that our job is to be, in terms of Hasidism, the Beinani, the struggler. The struggler. Sometimes we fall in the struggle. We're considered a Russia. But the strugglers, let's call ourselves the strugglers. And that is the whole Jewish people in one sentence. The righteous, the holy righteous, and then there's the rest that are, the strugglers. And why did God make that? So actually, if you go to, Tanya, chapter 36, is a famous question, asks that question, says, you know what? It's not only that, you got to have all types. Is that, no, they both play a role in the Or La'amim and being transformed in the world of light. If you have the person in the ivory tower, they might study Torah and not sin or have access to sin as much. And that's very important because they're becoming sort of a pipeline to the divinity. But at the same time, you have the rest of us that we engage in the world, and through us being connected to the tzaddik, the kohen, we're like in the storm with a rope. But then we get to transform the storm. They can't transform the storm because they're the window. So that's I guess.
So to bring it more to the mundane, it's sort of like you have the brain and you have the heart, which we just talked about. But the extremities, you have to feed the brain and the heart with food. The extremities bring the food to the brain and to the heart so that they can survive. Because the brain and the heart cannot do anything for themselves.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So I see it. That's the way I kind of see it, as those of us that are not part of the tzaddikim or a halev or whatever it is, that it's that we are the extremities. We bring the engagement for them to help us.
We're in Moshe, an example of Moshe, but I think it applies to Aaron. We're their feet. They can't go anywhere without the feet.
Right.
So, and the goal is not to live in one station and one chair your whole life. You have to go places. A person is called a mahalech, a goer in Kabbalah, because you have to move and progress. And anyways, so that's a little bit about why there are kohanim. You had a question, I believe. You had another couple questions.
Yeah. I have another question. So there's a significant discussion about the priestly installation rites in this parsha. The offering, etc. Again, we have a serious discussion about how to arrange and wear the Aaron's priestly garments and sort of the specific ornate functionality of them, which I think was interesting about the headdress and some of the other things. There's also a section relating to the rites of installation. So right. Can you explain further what the ascent offering is and what its relevance? And secondly, the second sacrifice represents the installation offering. Again, what is the importance of the process here? I would like a little more depth to that.
So I can tell you generally, there's a few types of karbanos or sacrifices, and they were there at the first day as well. One is an ola. Ola means a totally burned up offering. It goes on the altar entirely. There's nothing left for the owner or for the kohen to eat. It's solely for God. Then you have other karbanos sacrifices like the chatas, the sin offering, which a person who sinned would bring it, or sometimes the kohanim on behalf of the people in certain situations would bring it. And it was a sort of an atonement. It was atonement. And parts of it will be eaten by the kohen, actually. And it's part of the atonement process. They'd sacrifice part of it, but then some of it they'd eat. And then there's the shlamim, the peace offerings, which was brought by, it's called a peace offering because everybody feels good about this. The owner brings it, he gets some of the meat, the kohen gets some of the meat, and God gets some of the meat. Or it's a goodwill offering, it's called many times, like I have gratitude. Why this was, I did not have a chance to research the intricacies of like step 1, 2, 3, but my guess is that if the primary focus of the temple was to do the offerings, the sacrifices, you're going to have a certain amount of that sort of, test ones of initial ones that sort of sanctify the altar as being used. So, for example, Moshe, just for the record, for the first 7 days of the actual erection of the Mishkan, Moshe did all the service himself. And I think with that, he readied it for Aaron to do it. He sort of anointed it by that. And then Aaron did it, probably anointed it further. And it was a mix of the sacrifices that would have been done, that will be done forever. So, I don't have an answer as far as why these ones were necessary. It sort of makes sense to me if this is what's done in the temple, and the people and the Kohanim are just representative of all the people who bring the sacrifice, donate the sacrifices. You're going to have some sacrifices as an initial inaugural rites.
So let me bring it back to the relevance of prayer today. So where in the prayer today, where is the offering sacrifice, and where is the goodwill sacrifice? Where within our prayer? Where do we find those? 'Cause I'm sure that there was a sort of a pattern, right, that we were trying to follow in some way.
So here's an example. It says actually in this Torah portion, it says about the morning and afternoon lamb, and they did it this time, the first time, and they did it forever. It says this is forever, the statute forever. The Shacharis came to the morning prayers we do is in place of that morning lamb. The Mincha is in place of that afternoon lamb, and the evening service was that the remaining, I think, limbs that were on the altar into night was Ma'ariv represents that. It wasn't a third sacrifice, but it was the remaining limbs that could last on the altar through parts of the night. So that's what, that's just a simple, correspondence. This is morning, afternoon, that's evening.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, I think, we have a lot of questions about the sacrifices because we can't relate to it. And therefore, like every time we get into details, like what's this, that, because the whole thing is so hard to wrap your mind around. Right? Like, so I heard once I read a really great article I found that it was according to Kabbalah and Hasidism about what the sacrifices mean, and we can at least wrap our mind around its premise, it's what it did. So we believe in Judaism that the world is created from God, and by God's word, whatever that means, is a type of energy, and everything is created from God's word. Let's break the world into 4 kingdoms: the human, animal, vegetative, and mineral. If that's right, that's the whole world. So everything fits into there, and it all comes first from God's one, and God decides there's going to be a world. So God says, "Let there be trees, let there be people," and that utterance, the divine utterance, is the energy that's sort of pulsating and giving us constant existence. And now we have a world with this billions of trillions, billions of organisms. So the problem is that everything looks very autonomous, right? That's the way it is. The world looks very multifaceted, different stuff, divisions, and autonomy, independent of a oneness. The idea of a Jew, we know, is to bring oneness into everything. That's our whole thing. In spite of it looks like there's so much stuff. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Echad. God is one. Somehow it's all connected together. The temple was, again, the place where you saw God's presence in the most revealed way. So it took all that stuff, and if you notice, on the altar you have representation of all 4 kingdoms. You have the human being, the Kohen, who brings the sacrifice, the animal kingdom. There's the flour offering, the wine offering, and the oil, vegetative. And then it doesn't say in this parish, it says elsewhere about the salt. There ought to always be salt by the altar, mineral. And the Kohen would bring this sort of, this little package, microcosm together. And then a fire would descend from heaven, a little fire from below, but then it's a larger fire from heaven. And what does that actually mean? So he says it's creation in reverse. Before you start with God, one God, he says, let there be stuff, 4 kingdoms of stuff. And then there's stuff. Now we're taking all that stuff in this very pristine environment of God's will in the temple, the epicenter of God's will, and bring a sacrifice and all this with all the stuff. We're actually doing our best to recalibrate it to oneness. And indeed, then a fire would come down, a heavenly fire that would sort of unravel the differences of all this stuff and show how it's all one. It wasn't necessarily, I don't know if it was like only literal fire. It was a fire with a purpose. It was to unravel the divisions of stuff and bring it back into one. So it's creation in reverse.
That's an interesting concept. I've never thought about it in those terms. I have some questions about sacrifice. Obviously, I mean, one of the things, and I know I didn't pose this question when I sent these to you, but when when Moshiach comes and the temple is recreated, do we pray or do we sacrifice?
So Maimonides, who's the most, I guess, biggest authority on Jewish law, says, and many, it's not just him. He's just a compendium of all the Jewish law. There definitely will be sacrifices. That's like Maimonides in the 12th century kept writing about all the sacrifices, not only as a historical, symbolic thing to remember, but also that it will happen. But someone asked the Rebbe this, by the way. Someone asked the Rebbe in more modern times, sacrifices really? Like, come on. The Rebbe said that human sensibilities will change. Meaning to us, you're right, it's crazy now, an exile diaspora. We can't appreciate it. But when the world will be elevated, the sensibilities will be much more spiritual, right? There won't be as much jealousy and strife. Mashiach, number one, there will be harmony. That is number one. And there will be greater spirituality. The human sensibilities will change to understand, and it'll be a different world order in a sense, at least from the human psyche, that we will appreciate and realize what these sacrifices were, even though now we can talk about it. I can give you a nice article, but it's hard to really appreciate this idea.
And that's a good answer for it. Actually, I like the idea that we'll be in a different plane as opposed to where we are today. So I like that. That's satisfactory. I like that. I'm not big on sacrifice, obviously.
Many are.
It does not appeal to my sensibility now, and I would have a hard time sacrificing animals to.
Absolutely, and you're not, and that's so. I think that's look. The Rebbe really said we're in this transition period. The world is this crazy world, the best of times in many ways. I wouldn't say it's the worst of times because there's a lot of bad in the world, but historically we're in the best of times in many ways, prosperity and whatever. There's still some kinks to work out. Don't get me wrong, but we have to get to the finish line. But once we do, it's going to be a different human world order.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes,
or do we?
One more.
Okay.
Yes, one more.
Well, okay. Hopefully we can make this one a short one, but I don't think it'll be short, but that's okay.
Okay.
So my final question really relates to the building of the Holy of Holies. Understanding that this altar was only used during Yom Kippur to atone for any defilement of the tabernacles, which it states in the Parsha during the past year. Does this limit entry this limited entry and use recognize or denote some higher level of attainment to God and God's dwelling place, only attainable by the high priest on our behalf? And why is that? Right?
So definitely, it's the Holy of Holies, not for no reason. It's definitely it says the Shekhinah, the divine presence was even more, concentrated there. I mean, God spoke to Moshe from the cover of the ark, and that voice would go out into the outer sanctuary, but it originated there. So obviously, this is very concentrated spiritual epicenter of within the temple. Why is that? Because we have to realize, I think the simple answer is just we answered before, the Kohen, right? The God makes nature that, they're supposed to, not everything, the expression of everything's important, nothing's important. Meaning you could only access this closest place of God in the three categories that Kabbalah calls Olam, Shana, Nefesh. We say everything in the world is back to either time, space, and person, the observer, right? So there's Olam, place, world, Shana, year or time, and Nefesh, the soul, the observer, the person. To access that very close, this incredible fusion of infinity and infinitude can only be done in the most pristine of conditions. The holiest person, the Kohen Gadol, the holiest time, Yom Kippur, in the holiest place within the temple. And that was, of course, that was a way we could unpack that experience via the Kohen the whole year. Because again, there's always a duality. There's the spiritual pristine, but then the goal is to actually take that and transform the unpristine. So you
Right.
want to keep the pristine,
Right.
and because the pristine is not about pristine, it's about connecting to infinity. So it has to be very, very, God perfection there in a sense. But the goal is to then take it and transform mundane stuff, mundane life.
Right, which I like that aspect actually, because there's a concentration of God's holiness within the Holy of Holies, and yet those of us that are outside of that actually benefit from at least some pieces of it. Right, we're not there totally where the Kohen Gadol is, but we get to experience some of it, which I think it's kind of an interesting concept.
As you said before, the heart does not live for itself. So therefore, the Kohen only had that role on behalf of us. And this is a very West, it's kind of Eastern versus Western. Is the goal about, us becoming the best, or is it about everything having its purpose and, everything becoming elevated? So, all right.
Anyways, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom,
you. It was
Shabbos.
wonderful studying again this
Yes,
week.
I got to tell you, I really
it.
appreciate it. You make me study. I have to take my books out the night before. I'm really.
And me too. I have to really concentrate on the parsha, which I haven't never really done that, and I find it fascinating. I hope everybody on the podcast is finding it as
I think they
interesting as
are.
we do.